So the first commendation for Task Group 3 is that they are to be commended for what we term form following function. And what I mean by that is that there was great ingenuity and creativity and risk-taking in their actual presentation, which also was different and innovative in that it emphasized inclusivity, and something that in quality assurance we very much encourage in our universities, and that is a participatory mode of acting together. The second commendation is that the task force tackled the issue of risk-taking with diligence and with persistence, since the group, and I have to admit for objectivity here that I was initially part of Group 3. I initially worked with Fred and his colleagues, and then when Marissa asked me to take on this different role, I dropped out. But the group was working with moving targets, and so I think that you're to be commended for the diligence and persistence of having a steadfastness to stick with those moving targets and make sense out of them. And then the third commendation was one that I actually wrote just sitting here listening to your presentation. I think you're to be commended for something that I hope we don't lose, a notion, and that is, Renata, you actually had mentioned it in your last comments on behalf of your whole task force. You suggested what I heard as a new tripartite pillar, if you will, of talking about university education and universities' missions, in that you referenced research, teaching, and innovation. Michael, I'm so sorry. See, you're such a group that one doesn't know who said what. Thank you. But on behalf of the group, I thought that was very interesting, and if indeed we had that new framework, that in and of itself could be a monumental contribution. Okay, recommendations. First recommendation. Indeed, constructive steps were taken to define risk-taking, and now the task force needs to examine how institutions and academia as a whole can shift from maintaining reward structures that both evaluate faculty and encourage and promote doctoral students that take into account risk-taking ventures. And this came up to some extent during the course of a very rich discussion we had after the task force presented. That now, if you really want to move into risk-taking, so what are the reward structures going to look like to actually take that risk-taking into consideration? One thing, and this is just an aside, I wrote a brochure. I was always on a non-tenure track in the United States because I always thought you couldn't take risks if you were on a tenure track. And I always thought it would be interesting to involve in evaluation reward structures. Faculty are never rewarded for submitting grant applications. They're only rewarded if they actually get the grant. Wouldn't it be interesting if we thought of ways that you actually reward people for all the preparation that goes into it? That's also part of risk-taking. Okay, second recommendation, which builds upon the first. How can the task force suggest mechanisms for evaluating risk-taking ventures with a very different set of criteria than the conventional criteria that are now used? It seemed to me, as both when I read your paper, but even more so when I listened to the presentation, that you're really suggesting a very different approach, a very different, I believe our colleague, now I'm not going to remember who said what, but I believe it was our colleague from the Max Planck Institute who talked about a different attitude of approaching these issues. And so what different set of criteria might universities now use that are not standardized in terms of actually evaluating risk-taking ventures? Third, it might be helpful for the task force to focus on who actually in the university, who in the system of higher education sets the climate that says risk-taking is valued. The focus can not only be on products, because whether we admit it or not, academia is a very political environment. And so who is going to say that this is valued? Who being the university president, the ministry, the board of trustees, if you're in an American or Canadian context. But who is going to do this? Fourth, what structural conditions and systemic conditions enhance or preclude risk-taking for PhD students? I'm just going to stop there. What structural conditions have to exist? Not just faculty and people. You know, I won't name faculty because they're all over this room. But it's not just the professors, but what structural conditions need to actually exist. And then the fifth recommendation would be, how do we ensure that risk-taking departments that foster risk-taking students are not perceived as, quote, second-class departments or second-class people. Part of when I was reading the paper, I'm a political scientist by training, and I thought about all the modernization literature that I read as a political scientist. I know I'm totally surrounded by scientists here. Any political scientists here? Hardly. Ah, okay, a few. Well, when reading modernization literature, it talks about the center and the periphery. And you can, the center being, we talked about the North-South dialogue. You can talk about the countries being in the center and then developing nations being the periphery. Well, you could use that same analogy in a university. You have the center where you have the more conventional, rich departments, and then you have those on the periphery. And if we talk about all the issues we were raising today about risk-taking, the concern would be is that what do we have to do to ensure that these risk-taking departments are not those that are on the periphery? And then if I may, I just want to say two things as I was thinking about these issues, which are fascinating. That, you know, when we're trying to really change the higher education environment, there are probably three structures in society that are extraordinarily difficult to change. One is the clergy, one is the legal system, and the third one could argue is academia. I mean, our traditions have been around for literally hundreds of years, and people have written eloquently about that. So it seems to me that two variables that one really has to focus on, whether we're talking about the shift in intellectual capital, which is our first task force's concern, or the issues of diversity, which is the second, or the ones about risk-taking, which is the third, are really two variables. And this I know that our colleague from the Max Planck Institute did refer to the word. He used the word authority. And in a way, what we're really looking at when we want to make change and we want to address new forces and new forms, we're really, in a sense, talking about shifts of power and shifts of authority. And so I hope that as we begin to talk about how we inculcate change, how we promote risk-taking, how we diversify not only who is a part of doctoral education, but the kinds of programs that we really also take into account, to the extent that it's appropriate, who has the authority, who is in power, and how do we affect and how do we influence those individuals? Because I think it is that, Marissa, ultimately, that will have the impact on what you and your colleagues are trying to bring about in this network with forces and change in doctoral education. Thank you.